I was only 19 minutes late to my own daughter's Christmas Eve dinner. I had the pecan pie Margaret taught me to bake balanced on the passenger seat, still warm through the foil, and I was talking to her the way I always did when I drove alone now. You'd be proud of this one, Maggie. I finally got the filling right. Low heat, like you always said. The radio was playing something soft and instrumental, the kind Margaret used to hum along to without knowing she was doing it. Outside, the December sky over Knoxville was the color of old pewter, heavy with the kind of cold that settles into your joints before it settles into the air. The dashboard clock read 5:41 p.m. Dinner was at 6. I had time. I figured wrong. The pickup ahead of me braked hard without warning, and I saw it before I understood it. A woman standing in the breakdown lane of I-640, both hands pressed flat against the driver's window of a gray sedan, her whole body shaking. Not from cold, from something worse. I pulled onto the shoulder before I made the decision to do it. That's how it works when you've spent 32 years as an electrician. You don't deliberate. You move toward the problem. She was maybe 35, dark coat, no gloves, her breath coming out in short, panicked bursts. Through the window, I could see a man slumped forward against the steering wheel, not asleep. The angle was wrong. I was already on the phone with 911 before I reached her. Possible cardiac event. I-640 eastbound, just past the Merchant Drive exit. I'm with the vehicle now. Sir, do not move him unless he stops breathing. Understood. Sending my location. His name was Dennis Whitmore. I found that out later. At the time, all I knew was that he was 61 years old, wearing a red flannel shirt, and his lips had gone the color of a winter sky. I kept my hand on the doorframe and talked to him through the glass, the way you talk to someone whose attention keeps trying to drift somewhere you can't follow. Stay with me, friend. Help is coming. Just keep your eyes open. Tell me your name. His mouth moved. Nothing came out that I could make into a word. That's okay. You don't have to talk. Just look at me. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, I learned that a man can communicate a great deal with his eyes when his body has stopped cooperating with him. I learned that the woman who'd been beating on his window was a stranger who'd pulled over just like I had and was now standing 20 feet back, one hand over her mouth, watching. And I learned that 19 minutes late to a Christmas Eve dinner doesn't mean much when measured against 11 minutes on a highway shoulder in the dark. When the paramedics moved me aside and got the door open, Dennis Whitmore reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was weak but deliberate. Thank you. The words came out rough, scraped clean the way words get when they mean exactly what they say, and nothing extra. Don't mention it, I told him. Go. Let them help you. By the time I pulled back onto I-640, the clock read 6:09 p.m. The pie had gone slightly cold. I pressed the accelerator and told myself it didn't matter. My daughter had always said the door was always open. I turned onto Ridgewood Circle at 6:22 p.m. and parked at the curb in front of the house I had helped Thomas and Carla pick out 7 years ago. A 4-bedroom colonial with a covered front porch and a yard I had resodded myself the spring after they moved in because the previous owners had let it go to bare clay, and I couldn't stand to watch my daughters, children grow up in a yard that looked like a construction site. The lights inside burned gold through the windows. Warm, domestic. The look of a house that had filled itself up with people who belonged there. Something made me slow down at the porch steps. The front door was open 3 inches, not wide enough to mean anything, just enough that voices carried through the gap and into the cold December air. I wasn't trying to listen. I was reaching for the door handle when my son-in-law Thomas's voice separated itself from the background noise of silverware and children. Honestly, every year it's the same thing. He shows up late, and the whole evening has to reorganize itself around him. I stopped. Carla's voice, lower, the careful tone she used when she was trying to sound measured. Tom, he means well. I know he means well. He always means well. But Carla, do you know how exhausting it is to manage him? He sits at the table, and your mother talks to him like he's a guest. The kids would have been just fine. A pause, the sound of a chair shifting. We all would have been just fine. The cold went through me the way current goes through a wire when the insulation's been stripped. Clean, immediate, leaving nothing between you and the thing itself. I stood on that porch holding a pecan pie I had baked from Margaret's handwritten recipe card, in her handwriting, with the small star she'd drawn next to add extra vanilla. Trust me. And I waited. I waited the way I had waited on 100 job sites over 32 years. The way you wait when you've already measured and you know the number is going to come back wrong, but you're still hoping you misread the tape. Then my daughter spoke. Not prompted, not dragged into it. Just her voice, easy and settled. The voice of a woman confirming something she'd already decided was true. "You're right," she said. "It's honestly just easier when it's the four of us." I thought about the resodded yard, about the gutters I'd cleaned last October because Thomas had mentioned they were backing up and nobody had gotten around to it, about the basement water heater I'd replaced over a July weekend while they took the kids to Pigeon Forge so they wouldn't have to deal with contractors in their house, about the $28,000 personal loan I'd co-signed 3 years ago because they'd said they needed to stabilize after Thomas changed jobs, money I had not once asked about since the day I signed my name to it. Margaret had looked at me over her coffee cup the morning I signed that loan and said, "Frank, you can love someone and still make them stand on their own feet. Those aren't opposites." I had squeezed her hand and told her she worried too much. I reached into my coat pocket and found the spare key I'd carried for 7 years, because this was my daughter's house, but I'd been the one to pick up the locksmith bill when she lost hers. I let myself in. 11 faces turned toward the dining room doorway. I recognized 10 of them without effort. The 11th stopped everything in my chest for 3 full seconds. Sitting at the far end of the table, in the seat closest to the kitchen, holding a glass of red wine and wearing a red flannel shirt that had been recently changed or recently cleaned, was Dennis Whitmore. His color was better. Someone had straightened his collar. He looked like a man who had been given a second chance at a dinner he wasn't sure he deserved to finish. He looked at me from across the length of that table, and then he looked at his wine glass. Carla recovered first. She always did. Her spine straightened, and her smile arranged itself into the version she used when she needed the room to stay calm. "Dad," we were starting to worry. "Come in, sit down. We saved you a seat." I crossed the dining room and set the pie tin on the mahogany sideboard, the one I'd built in my garage 11 years ago, sanded over 3 weekends, finished with 2 coats of tung oil, because Maggie said it brought out the grain better than anything else. I set it down carefully. The way you set something down when you need your hands to be still and your face to stay even. Then something small and fast hit me at hip level. "Grandpa, you're here. I saved your napkin." Emma, 7 years old, wearing a green velvet dress that Margaret would have said was too formal for a child, and perfect for a child at the exact same time. She had both arms locked around my waist and her chin tilted all the way up to see my face. I put my hand on the back of her head. Her hair was soft and warm. "Hey, sweetheart." My voice held. I was grateful for that. "I'm here." She pulled back and looked up at me with the seriousness that children wear when they're delivering important news. "Daddy said you were probably stuck in traffic. But I told Owen you were definitely coming because you always come." I crouched down to her level, eye to eye. "You were right," I said. "I'm always coming. Mom said it was okay if you missed dinner." She said it the way children say things, pure fact, no cruelty in it, no awareness of the weight. Something shifted behind my sternum, not breaking exactly, bending under something that had been pressing on it longer than I'd admitted. I kissed the top of her head, straightened up, and looked around the table. Thomas had his hands around his water glass so tight I could see the pale of his knuckles. Carla was watching me with the careful attention of someone tracking which direction a storm will turn. Dennis Whitmore was looking at the centerpiece with the focused attention of a man who needed something to look at that wasn't me. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one Emma had saved, and sat down. I shook out my napkin. I reached for the serving dish. "Don't let me interrupt," I said pleasantly. "I just want everyone to know I'll be calling Tom's brother at Tillman Realty first thing Wednesday morning. I've decided to sell the lake cabin." The serving spoon hit the edge of the casserole dish as Carla's hand jerked forward. She recovered fast, but not fast enough. Every drop of color left her face in the space of a single breath. "Dad." Her voice came out strange, thinner than usual. "What did you just say?" "The cabin on Lake Norris. Your grandmother left it to me in 2009. I've been covering the property taxes, the dock maintenance, the insurance. I placed a modest portion of green beans onto my plate. for 16 years. I think it's time to simplify. You cannot be serious right now. Thomas set his fork down. His voice had shed its dinner party tone entirely. That cabin is where we take the kids every summer. Emma learned to swim off that dock. Owen caught his first fish there. They did, I agreed. I was there for both of those things. I'm glad they happened. I buttered my roll with the focused attention of a man who had spent 32 years doing precise work and understood that quality depended entirely on not rushing. But I own the property, and since my presence apparently makes family gatherings more difficult to manage, I've decided to do some managing of my own. Dennis Whitmore looked up from the centerpiece. For one fraction of a second, across the full length of that table, his eyes met mine. I saw everything I needed to see in that fraction of a second. The recognition, the shame, the specific misery of a man who understood exactly what he owed and had not yet found the courage to pay it. Then he picked up his wine glass and looked away. "Grandpa, can you pass the cranberry sauce?" Emma's voice, entirely unconcerned with the temperature of the room. "Of course, sweetheart," I said. "Of course I can." Thomas pushed back from the table. "Frank, I need you to think about what you're doing right now. The kids are sitting right here. Carla's aunt is sitting right here. This is Christmas Eve. I know what night it is," I said. "I also know what I heard through a 3-inch gap in that front door about 25 minutes ago. We all have different vantage points tonight, Tom." The table went so still I could hear the candles. Carla's aunt shifted in her seat. Dennis Whitmore cleared his throat and said nothing. "Dad." Carla's voice had dropped into a register I'd never heard from her before. Low and unsteady, and for the first time in a long time unmanaged. That was a private conversation. Through an open door, on a cold night, while I was standing on the porch with a pie I baked from your mother's recipe. The room had nothing to say to that. I set my fork down. "I'm not going to make a scene at your table, Carla. That's not why I said what I said. I said it because I've spent 7 years acting like a guest in the life of this family while paying for parts of it like an owner. That ends on Wednesday." Thomas stood up fully now. "Frank, can we please talk about this somewhere that isn't—" "I heard you tell my daughter that the evening would be easier without me," I said quietly. "So, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish my dinner." Silence settled over the table like the first layer of snow. Soft, total, changing the shape of everything it covered. I picked up my fork. Emma reached over and put her small hand on top of mine. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand there, the way children do when they understand something is wrong and have no words for it but know that contact helps. I turned my hand over and held hers for a moment. Then I finished my dinner. I sat in my truck in the driveway for a long time before I drove home, not thinking, not feeling exactly. Just sitting in the particular suspension that comes after something large has shifted, and your body needs a moment before it decides what to do next. Inside, I didn't bother with the overhead lights. I filled the kettle by the glow of the stove clock and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark to wait for the water. On the shelf above the sink, Margaret's small collection of seed catalogs stood between 2 clay bookends Emma had painted for her grandmother's last birthday. In the windowsill, the potted rosemary Maggie had grown from a cutting was still green, still alive. I watered it every morning without quite knowing why. It just seemed important not to let the things she had kept alive stop being alive. My phone buzzed from across the room. Then again, short bursts, the rhythm of someone who was not planning to stop. I let it buzz. I thought about Margaret. Not the last year, not the illness, the earlier version Margaret at 40, laughing at something on the radio, Margaret in this kitchen at 6 in the morning, with her reading glasses pushed up in her hair, Margaret sitting on the porch swing the evening before I co-signed that loan, looking at me with the expression she reserved for moments when she'd already decided not to argue. "Frank, you can love someone and still make them stand on their own feet." I got up, went to the laptop on the desk in the corner, and opened the bank's online portal. The joint account I had opened for Carla and Thomas 3 years ago came up on the second click. The account I had told myself was a practical measure, a buffer for genuine emergencies. I scrolled through 90 days of transactions without hurrying. $340 at a home furnishing store I recognized from a neighborhood Thomas had once called up and coming, which I had come to understand meant expensive. $195 at a spa. $420 at a restaurant I'd never heard of. And there, 6 weeks ago, no merchant name, no description, just the raw transaction code and the number staring up at me from the screen. Cash withdrawal, ATM, $4,100. No receipt, no explanation, no corresponding purpose I could find anywhere. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I navigated to the county property records for the Lake Norris cabin. I read through the entry the way I'd read through a wiring diagram, nothing assumed, nothing skipped. Owner of record, Franklin Ray Alderman. Date recorded, the 14th of October, 2009. Encumbrances, none. Mine, fully, legally, without ambiguity. I closed the laptop. Outside, the first snow of December was beginning to fall past the kitchen window, catching the streetlight and drifting down in long, unhurried arcs. I thought about my old foreman, Gene Paulson, who'd retired to a place outside Asheville and had been calling me every few months for 2 years, asking when I was going to come down and help him finish the workshop addition he'd been building on his property. Every time, I'd told him soon. There was always something. A gutter to clean, a water heater to replace, a loan to co-sign. I opened my email. I wrote Gene Paulson a message. 3 sentences. I'm coming in January. Tell me which weekend works. I'll bring my tools. He replied in 8 minutes. About damn time, Frank. First weekend, the coffee'll be hot. I turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a while longer. My hands were on the table. I noticed they were completely steady. The knocking started at 8:15 the next morning. Not a knock, the sound of a fist against wood with intention. 3 heavy impacts, then the doorbell twice in rapid succession. I looked through the peephole. Carla stood on the welcome mat, alone. No Thomas. Her eyes were red at the rims. Her hair was unbrushed, which in 26 years of knowing my daughter I had never once seen before she was ready to be seen. I opened the door. Dad. Her voice was stripped of the careful management she'd been running since last night. My debit card was declined this morning at Publix, in the checkout line, with both kids standing there. I closed the account, I said. The joint account where every dollar came from my savings. Since I'm simplifying my arrangements, as I mentioned last night, that seemed like the right place to start. You can't just... She stopped, pressed her fingers to her forehead, started again. Dad, what was said last night that was between me and Tom? You weren't supposed to hear that. I know, I said. That's the part worth thinking about, Carla. Not that I heard it, but that it was said. She was quiet for a moment, long enough that I could hear a bird somewhere behind me in the yard. A cardinal. From the sound of it, the short, clean note they make in winter, like a small bell struck once. The cabin. Her voice was smaller now. Careful. Dad. Emma has been talking about next summer since August. She has a whole plan for which kayak she wants to learn on. You can't sell the cabin because of one conversation you heard through a door. I'm not selling it because of the conversation, I said. I'm selling it because of what the conversation showed me I'd been not seeing for a long time. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at me. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, she looked at me the way she used to when she was small, not managing me, not including me as an item on a social checklist, just looking. Dad. Her voice broke on the word. Not performed. I had known this woman since before she could walk, and I knew the difference. I didn't mean it the way it came out. Tell me how you meant it. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes filled. I can't, she said quietly. Because I'm not sure I can explain it without making it worse. But I know that She stopped again. I know that when I picture the cabin, Dad, you're in every single memory in it. You taught Emma to bait a hook on that dock. You built the screened porch with Owen sitting in a lawn chair handing you nails when he was 4 years old. I know that. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. At the exhausted truth of her face, unguarded in a way it so rarely was. I know you know it, I said finally. What I need you to understand is that knowing it and showing it are 2 different things. And for a long time, Carla, the second one, has been missing. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, held it there. I'm not closing the door, I said. I'm not walking away from you or those kids. But I'm done arranging my life around being convenient. You understand the difference? She nodded. Once, it cost her something. Go home, I said gently. Give everyone some time to breathe, including yourself. I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I walked to the kitchen, poured a second cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. My hands were still steady. There was a call I had been putting off since sometime around 2 in the morning, one I needed to make before the day went any further. Phil Garrett had been my closest friend since 1987. We'd come up through the same apprenticeship program, worked the same commercial sites for the first decade, drifted into different specialties but never out of each other's orbit. He'd done electrical work at the Lake Norris cabin twice over the years. He knew the property. He knew the family situation, the way old friends know things, not from being told, but from paying attention over many years. 3 weeks ago, Phil had called me on a Tuesday while I was in the garage organizing my conduit inventory. We talked about the usual things, his knee, my knee, whether the Vols had a shot this season, and then, toward the end of the call, his voice had changed register in a way I'd noticed but not examined. "Hey Frank," he'd said, "everything okay with Carla and Tom? With the arrangements and everything?" "Far as I know," I'd told him. "Why?" "No reason," Phil said. "A beat too fast. Just checking." I had let it go. I hadn't been ready in that particular October to pull on a thread I could already feel was attached to something I didn't want to see. But I was ready now. Phil picked up on the second ring. I could hear the background sound of his shop, the radio he kept on low, the particular acoustic of a garage full of tools. "Frank, I figured you'd call. Phil, I need you to tell me what you almost told me in October." A long exhale. The radio clicked lower. "I've been sitting on this for a month and a half. You know I stay out of family business." "I know. Tell me anyway." He told me. It had been 14 months ago. He'd gone out to the Lake Norris cabin to replace the panel box, a job I'd arranged and paid for. Called Phil directly. Told him Thomas would be there to let him in. Carla had been at work. The kids were in school. Thomas had let him in, offered him water, been perfectly pleasant. Phil had finished the panel, come back through the main room to give Thomas the rundown. They'd talked for a few minutes about the cabin, the electrical load, the age of the appliances, and then Thomas had asked him something. "Phil," he'd said, "I don't want to make this weird, but if something happened to Frank, would Carla automatically get the cabin, since it's family property?" Phil's voice was flat and measured, the way a man speaks when he has been careful about how to say something for a long time. I told him that wasn't how it worked, that without a will specifically naming Carla, it would go through probate and wasn't guaranteed. He said, "Oh, I just want to make sure she's protected." And I said sure, and finished my water and left. But Frank, the way he said it, it wasn't about protecting her. "I've been thinking about it for 14 months. I was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell me then?" "Because it wasn't a crime. It was a question. But I have come back to that afternoon more times than I can count, and I keep arriving at the same place." A pause. "I should have told you. I'm sorry I didn't." "You're telling me now," I said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the December snow had stopped. The yard was white and clean and indifferent. Then I opened my email and wrote 3 sentences to the Tillman Realty address. "I'd like to discuss listing the Lake Norris cabin. I can meet Thursday at 10. Frank Alderman." The reply came in 12 minutes. "We'll be ready for you, Frank. That property is going to move fast." It was 4 days later when the story arrived at the piece of it I hadn't expected. My neighbor, Beverly Odom, who had lived in the gray house across the street for 20 years, who had brought casseroles for a month after Margaret's funeral, who knew everything that happened within 4 blocks and kept most of it to herself, called me on a Tuesday morning with the careful voice she used when she was about to hand over something that needed to be handled gently. "Frank," she said, "I need to tell you something about Dennis Whitmore and what he did this morning." I set down my coffee, she told me. Dennis Whitmore had appeared at her front door at 8:45, alone, without his wife, without Carla, without any of the social scaffolding that usually surrounded a visit. He was wearing his heavy coat and the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something for 3 weeks and had finally stopped being willing to put it off. Beverly had let him in. She'd poured him coffee. She'd sat across from him at her kitchen table and waited. He said, "Beverly told me. Beverly, I need to know about the man who helped me on Christmas Eve, on the highway. So I told him, she said. That's Frank Alderman, my neighbor for 20 years. One of the best men I have ever known. Dennis had sat with that for a minute. Just sat with it. And then he said, Beverly continued, her voice careful and steady. I was at that table. I knew who he was the moment he walked through that door. I recognized his face, and I recognized his voice, and I knew exactly what I owed him. And I sat there for 2 hours and I said nothing, not one word. A pause. He said, I have been trying to justify that to myself for 3 weeks. I cannot do it. I stood up from my chair and walked to the kitchen window. The backyard was snow-covered and still. At the back fence, the bird feeder Margaret had kept stocked since 2014 was empty and swaying slightly in the cold air. He went home, Beverly said, and he sat Thomas down. I closed my eyes for a moment. He told him everything. That you stopped on the highway when no one else did. That you stayed in the cold for 11 minutes in the dark talking to a man you'd never met. That you wouldn't even give Dennis your name afterward. He had to describe you to Carla to find out who you were. Beverly's voice softened by a degree. He told Thomas, the man your wife said made your evenings difficult had just finished keeping me alive when she said that. I let out a long breath. I hadn't realized I'd been holding. How did Thomas respond? I asked. My voice came out level. I was surprised by that. Dennis said he didn't respond right away, Beverly said. He sat at the kitchen table for a while, very still, not the angry kind of still. And then he said, I need to call Frank. And Dennis said, no, not yet. You have something to do first. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass of the window. Carla called him on her own, Beverly said quietly. Dennis told me she asked for your number and called without Thomas in the room. I was still standing at the window when my phone rang 20 minutes later. A number I didn't recognize. I let it ring once. Then I answered, Dad. Carla's voice came through the line, stripped of everything I had associated with it for too long. The careful management, the social performance, the faint distance that had grown so gradually I hadn't noticed when it became the default. What was left was something I had not heard from her since she was young, raw, unguarded. The voice of a person who had been shown something about themselves that they couldn't unsee and was still deciding how to live with it. My father-in-law told me what you did on the highway, she said. On Christmas Eve, before you came to our door. I didn't say anything. I waited. I don't expect anything from this call, she said. The words came out unsteady, like she'd prepared them, but the preparation hadn't accounted for the actual doing of it. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just needed you to know that I understand now what those two things were sitting next to each other. What you did for him. What I said about you. I needed you to know that I know. Her voice broke on the last word. Not a performance. I had known this woman for 26 years. I knew the difference. Margaret's rosemary was on the windowsill in front of me, still green, still growing, still somehow alive without her there to tend it. Take care of those kids, Carla, I said. That's all I'm asking. A long breath on her end. Okay, she said. Okay, I said. I ended the call and stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand. Then I walked to the garage. On my workbench, the small jewelry box I'd been building for Emma was nearly finished. Cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails at the corners because she was 7 years old and deserved something that would last until she was 37. The lid had a simple brass hinge I'd fitted over 2 evenings. I'd been waiting to carve her name on the front. I sat down on the stool, picked up the carving knife, and began. E-M-A. 3 letters. Her initials, the way her grandmother had always written them on birthday cards. Margaret's handwriting. My hands. I worked until the light in the garage went gold and long, the way December light does in late afternoon, when it has given up trying to be warm and settled for being beautiful. Gene Paulson met me in the driveway of his place outside Asheville on the second Saturday of January. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, the way men of a certain age greet each other when they know the first thing needed isn't a handshake. He handed me 1 cup. He looked at my truck. He looked at the toolbox in the bed. You actually came. I said I would, I told him. We stood in his driveway in the cold January air and drank our coffee and looked at the half-framed workshop addition at the back of his property. It was a good skeleton. He'd done the footings right. He just needed someone to help him finish what he'd started. You want to hear something? Gene said, Sure, I built this thing the same way I always built anything. Careful, square, not rushing the parts that needed time. He took a sip of his coffee. Margaret would have said that's the only way to build anything worth keeping. I looked at the framing, at the clean lines of it, at the potential of what it would be when it was done. She would have said exactly that, I agreed. I finished my coffee, set the cup on the tailgate, and pulled the toolbox toward me. Which wall do you want to start on? Jean Paulson grinned the way men grin when something they've been waiting for has finally arrived. Been waiting 2 years to hear you say that. I picked up my hammer. The handle was warm from the truck cab, broken in across 32 years in a way that no new tool ever quite manages. I found the first nail. I set it. I drove it home. The sound rang out clean and certain across the cold January air. If you are the one who shows up, the one who resods the yard and replaces the water heater and co-signs the loan and bakes the pie from a recipe in your late wife's handwriting, and you have started to feel like furniture in the lives of the people you love most, hear me, friend. You are not furniture. You are the foundation. And a foundation is not the same as a doormat. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to matter. You are allowed to drive 4 hours to a friend's property in the mountains and spend a January building something that is yours. Do not wait for a 3-inch gap in a front door to tell you what you are worth. This is not a story about revenge. It never was. It's a story about a man who finally understood the difference between being needed and being valued, and chose, at 63 years old, to go find out what the second one felt like. If this story found something in you, a memory, a face, a situation you've been too patient inside, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. Because some stories are less about the person telling them and more about the person who needed to hear them at exactly the right moment. Stay with me, there are more.